Bless you, man. Thank you, buddy. Love you, buddy.
Thank you. Well, in spite of United Airlines and TWA, I made it here at 9:45 last night. I'm so glad you had a chance to have a break. My dad always taught me, he said, Hal, the mind cannot take in more than the bladder can hold. Always remember that. So I'll try to remember that. It's exciting. I can't, with these lights, I can barely see, and I'm one of those people that has to see his audience. So I'll try my best. But I am very excited to be part of this prophecy conference, especially to follow Solomon Gershom, because we're going to talk about the same sort of thing. Jerusalem, oh Jerusalem. How can a city stir such passion in so many people? Why? You know, as you look at this city, there are others that might be technically more beautiful. And indeed, as you look at Jerusalem and you look at its history, it's hard to determine why it has become such a center of passion for so many people, because it doesn't have the normal things that made cities great. As you look at the great cities of the earth, you'll find that they were usually founded because they were on a natural harbor by the ocean, or they were on a big river, or they were part of a big trade route, on a leading trade route through the world, or they were near some large source of fresh water. There was always some reason like that that originated the great cities of the earth. But when you look at Jerusalem, none of those factors are there. It was not near any major caravan trail or trade route. It doesn't have any major sources of fresh water. It's not on a river. It's not by a great harbor. And you look at it and you find it's on the way to nowhere. It's not even on the highest mountain. But yet, for thousands of years, people have looked toward that city, and it has stirred great passion for one reason or another. We look back in history in the Word of God, and we find some of the reasons that make it great, though. We look back 4,000 years ago, when Abraham had just defeated the forces that had taken Sodom and Gomorrah captive. And Abraham only had one big reason for going and rescuing those people. It was because his nephew, Lot, lived there, and they'd taken him captive. So in the process of rescuing him, he liberated the rest of them with it. And suddenly, out of nowhere, a man not seen before nor afterwards appeared, and his name was Melchizedek. And Melchizedek was recognized by Abraham to be a great spiritual leader and superior to him, because Abraham bowed to him and gave him tithes of all that he had taken. And he even followed the directive that the priest said. He was a priest, and it says he was the king of righteousness. Melchizedek in Hebrew means king of righteousness. And he even took the oath that he heard from this priest: I've raised my hand to God Almighty. And it's revealed that this priest was from the city of Salem. That was the first mention of the city of Jerusalem. And we find right there the key to why this city has been at the center of world passion for so long. It has none of the commercial reasons for making it great, or the usual geographical reasons for making it great. It's great because it's always been associated with spiritual things. And then, much later, when Joshua came and under the direction of God captured Canaan. You know, an amazing thing, they did not capture Jerusalem. And by this time, it was called Jebus. And the Jebusites kept control of Jerusalem, even though Joshua and the Israelites captured everything else around the area, except for a few places where the Philistines kept on the coast. And of course, the Philistines are still giving them trouble today. But they didn't take Jerusalem. And many Christians don't realize that. And as a matter of fact, Israelites lived in Jebus, but they lived under the dominion and authority of the Jebusites until King David was moved by God to take that city and make it the capital of Israel and the place for the temple of God. And that's when David stirred, and he set out with his army, besieged the city. And when they besieged the city, this was such a fortress that the Jebusites, by the way, there were many giants in the Jebusites, they taunted David and his army. They laughed at them. They said, even the meek and the cripple could defend the city against you. And that's when we read, how many know that Psalm 24 was really a battle plan and a battle cry? Turn to Psalm 24. In Psalm 24, David quickly, David had a great talent. He was probably the greatest warrior that ever strapped on a sword, but he also was the psalmist of Israel. And he could write a psalm on the spot. And he composed this psalm on the spot with the Jebusites up there taunting them that they could not take that city. And here's what David had his men sing to the Jebusites. The earth is the Lord's and all it contains, and the world and those who dwell in it. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. Who may ascend in the hill of the Lord, and who may stand in his holy place? Now notice, he already recognizes this city as the Lord's and as a holy place. And he says, he who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not lifted up his soul to falsehood and has not sworn deceitfully, he shall receive a blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. This is the generation of those who seek him, who seek thy face, even Jacob. That being said, he then said to the gates of Jerusalem, lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. That's a strange chant for a man about to attack a city, isn't it? But that's what he did. Lift up your gates, that the King of glory may come in. And he said, and then he records what the Jebusites taunted back from the wall. This is what they said. Who is the King of glory? And then they answer back, the Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. And again the Jebusites said, who is this King of glory? They replied, the Lord of hosts, he is the King of glory. And then David said, The first man over the wall will have a lifetime free from the IRS. He literally did that because he said you will be free of taxes. Man, that's an incentive if I ever heard one. The first man over the wall was Joab, and he became general of the army and free of taxes. And they took Jebus. And then that was 3,000 years ago, over 3,000 years ago, and then they named it Jerusalem. Jerusalem. And from that moment on, it became the beating heart of every Israelite. There is a mystical love for that city in the heart of every Israelite that cannot be logically explained. I have talked with those who are religious, and they love it. But I've talked with many who are not religious at all, who are Israelites, and they love it. The heart of the nation is wrapped up in this city. Now, that little bit of thumbnail history is what sets the stage for the greatest conflict of our day, the controversy over who owns Jerusalem. 2,500 years ago, the prophet Zechariah predicted that in the last days, Jerusalem would become a controversy between the Israelites and the surrounding nations, which, by the way, are all Muslim today, and that this controversy would get so great that it would drag all the nations of the world into it. Zechariah chapter 12, verses 2 and 3 talk about this. God said, "Behold, I shall make Jerusalem a cup." In the Hebrew, literally, it says, a cup of intoxication to all of the surrounding nations. And what do we see today? All the Muslim nations around are intoxicated with a religiously driven intoxication over that city. What do you do when you're intoxicated? Well, having been intoxicated a lot in my early life, I can tell you, you act like a jackass. But you also do very, very illogical things, irrational things. And I believe that's what this means. Now let's look at the Muslim claim. It gives you a thumbnail sketch of the claim of the Israelites. Let's take a thumbnail sketch of the Muslim claim on Jerusalem. First of all, Islam didn't exist until the 7th century AD. Jerusalem is not mentioned one time in their holy book, the Quran. Not once. Jerusalem was taken some many decades after Islam began to spread. But it never was made a provincial capital. It's never been a capital of any Islamic state there. And as a matter of fact, most Muslims do not know it by the name Jerusalem. They know it as Al-Quds, which means Father's Mosque, Arabic. Because long after Muhammad's death, some Islamic scholars created the myth that would tie Islam into Jerusalem and give it a right to make it equally holy with the Jews and the Christians, because they wanted a right to be there because it was important to Jews and Christians. And so they use this very undefined, unclear statement in the Quran, which says that on the night of Muhammad's death, he went to the farthest mosque, Al-Quds. And so they said the farthest mosque was Jerusalem. Well, Muhammad had never been near Jerusalem. So they created the myth that he flew there on his horse that sprouted wings. Right. And just recently, in order to stick their finger in the eye of the Jews even more, they have now said that the Israelites not only do not have any right to the Temple Mount or to Jerusalem, but they don't even have a right to the Western Wall that's been named nicknamed the Wailing Wall, because they said that's where Muhammad tied his horse. So therefore it doesn't belong to them. Surprised they haven't even declared holy places all around there where horse manure might have fallen or something. I don't know. But in the Old Testament, which if you're a Jew or a Christian, we hold to be the Word of God, 767 times the city of Jerusalem is referred to, and it's always in a context of belonging to the Israelites. 767 times. The history goes back 3,000 plus years to David's conquest there. And so we look at something else that developed in the Muslim claim about Jerusalem that's even more amazing. I'll take you back in some recent history. Do you know when Jerusalem was first declared the third holiest site of Islam? Now remember, the first and second holiest site is Mecca and Medina in Arabia. In 1917, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who had fought against the British with the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Now, the Ottoman Turks had owned Jerusalem for 400 years, from 1517 to 1917. Hajj Amin al-Husseini was one of the big landholders there in Jerusalem, and he must have been a very clever diplomat, because he fought with all his might against the British. And then when the British took it over, he talked them into making him the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, which the British very foolishly did. And he led many terrorist attacks against the returning Jewish people in the 1930s until he got to be a wanted person because of the intensity of the terrorism that he was campaigning on. So he went to Berlin as the guest of Adolf Hitler. And there he was taught about how to handle the Jewish problem. And he even said at one of the big Nazi rallies, the Germans know how to deal with the Jews. Well, he also learned something else. He learned from Hitler and his minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, the technique of propaganda, especially the technique of the big lie. This is what Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf. In the primitive simplicity of their minds, they more readily fall victims to the big lie than the small lie, since they themselves often tell small lies in little matters, but would be ashamed to resort to large-scale falsehoods. He's talking about the average person, the average man. It would never come into their heads to fabricate colossal untruths, and they would not believe that others could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. Even though the facts which prove this to be so may be brought clearly to their minds, they will still doubt and waver and will continue to think there is some other explanation, end quote. That's why the big lie works. Tell a little one, you get caught. Tell a big one and tell it loud enough and often enough, the world will think, wow, no one could tell a lie that big, so it must be true. Now, that was the inspiration to go back to Jerusalem and really push this thing he had declared, that Jerusalem is the third holiest site of Islam. There's no historical reason for that claim except that the Husseinis have big land holdings in Jerusalem, and they wanted to bring tourists and people there from the Muslim side in order to enhance the value of their property. Gets back to the old motivation of the almighty buck. And the grandson of Amin al-Husseini, Faisal Husseini, who just died of a heart attack, took up apparently the same kind of ability. He died of a fatal heart attack in Kuwait just a few weeks ago. And of course, right away, the Palestinians began to pass around this dark hint that somehow the Israeli Mossad was involved in his heart attack. Now, that went unchallenged until just a couple of weeks ago, under General Ariel Sharon. I don't know him as prime minister, I know him as the general. And Sharon took over the Orient House, which was the unofficial, had been made the unofficial capital of the Palestinians against their signed agreement in the Oslo peace accords. They said they wouldn't do that. Guess who owns the Orient House? Faisal Husseini and his family. When they began to sift through the captured papers there, they found something that was really amazing. Faisal Husseini had been very cleverly taking the claims of Palestinians who were not able to be in Israel, not able to come there. He began to take their claims of land that they owned there in Jerusalem and sell it and send the money to his own bank account in Zurich. And 4 Arab states in the in the Persian Gulf sent millions of dollars, in fact $1.9 billion in money to aid the poor Palestinian people in Palestine. And by the way, I do feel sorry for some of the people that are suffering there, especially the Christian Palestinians. I feel sorry for them. They're caught between all of this. And they can't say one way or the other. If you're even remotely suspected of being a collaborator with Israel, you'll get a 10-minute trial and a quick firing squad, as many already have been. Where's the UN when they talk about human rights there? Now, anyway, this money was given by 4 of the Arab states, the Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and another that I've forgotten right now. I had it in my notes, but I don't have it now. But anyway, they found that this money had been carefully taken out of the country and put into Husseini's own bank account in Zurich. $1.9 billion. Now, you could help a lot of people with that, couldn't you? I mean, think about the difference between $1 million and $1 billion. The Israelis found this, and then they found that just shortly before Faisal Husseini had a heart attack, he was seen in a violent argument in the hotel lobby in Kuwait where he died with 4 people. They were from the 4 states that had been trying to get an answer to what he did with their money. So if anyone helped him go to paradise, it was his own people. Now, this is the sort of thing that you're bucking up against, though, when you come to this. In the Middle East, a myth has more power than the truth. Look at the blood that has been shed over a myth that was created about the Muslim claim to Jerusalem. I mean, look at the blood that was shed in the senseless crusades in the 11th through the 13th century. And now in recent times. But here is the incredible thing. Zechariah tells us that not only would the nations surrounding Jerusalem become intoxicated over Jerusalem, but it also goes on to say this, and I'll turn there to quote it directly. Zechariah chapter 12, verses 2 and 3. Where it says in verse 3, and it will come about in that day, I will make Jerusalem a heavy, burdensome stone for all the peoples. All who attempt to lift it will be severely injured. All the nations of the earth will be gathered because of it. Look at what's happening today. What's on CNN every week? What's in the headlines every week? The constant controversy over Jerusalem. And today, we have the Muslim nations in control of most of the oil reserves of the world. And so therefore, whatever troubles them begins to be the burden of the whole world. Because most of the civilized world depends on the oil coming from the Middle East in order to keep their economy. If there's any disruption of that flow right now, it's economic disaster for whatever country. And so therefore, Islam has made Jerusalem an issue. It's at the top of their agenda, and therefore they have made it the top of the world's agenda. Because who owns it is going to be made the issue. And you haven't seen anything yet. And of course, wrapped up in all of this is the fact that to the Israel, the third temple is the ultimate issue. They want they want the holy ground back. This so-called intifada right now was touched off because Eric Sharon had the audacity to simply walk around the Temple Mount. And you've stirred up a little bit of trouble too, haven't you, Colonel? I always leap for joy every time I hear about it. Well, it's going to be trouble. But ultimately, the temple of God is going to be built there again. You know, we face one of the most incredible things to show you how the United Nations is so uneven in their attempt to apply justice. Here's the application of the big lie again. The Muslim nations have been able to focus the attention of the world on this teeny little strip of real estate in the Middle East that's called Israel. In the Muslim Middle East, There are 650 million people, all of the same religion and same ethnic or cultural background. 650 million. They own 99.4% of all of the land of the Middle East. Israel has 0.6% of the land there. And they've been able to focus the attention of the world on the fact that Israel is holding out on the poor Palestinian refugees, and they should be taking care of them, and aren't they awful? Why don't they take care of them? Hey, I agree the average Palestinian has been mistreated. But not by Israel, by their own people. They've been fed a line of the big lie. You trace back, and I recommend a book to you, and you can get it on worldnetdaily.com, worldnetdaily.com. I started hollering about this book 10 years ago, and finally they took the initiative to have it reprinted. It's called From Time Immemorial. From Time Immemorial. An incredible historical treatise on the recent history of the Palestinian-Israeli question. Now, what this book documents and reveals is this: that at the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century, when the Jewish people fleeing persecution in Europe began in earnest to return to Palestine. By the way, do you know that during the centuries from 70 A.D. all the way up until the 19th century, most of the population of Jerusalem was Jewish? Many people don't bring that in. But in the late 19th century, especially when the Zionist movement was started by Theodor Herzl, and Jews began to flee persecution in Europe and to come at great cost and great suffering back to Israel, the Muslim nations saw that there was a serious threat of all of these Jews returning. And especially after 1917, when the British Mandate was issued, the Muslim nations began to send people from their countries into Palestine because they did not want the Jews to outnumber the Palestinians in their claim for that real estate. So they began to flood people in there, especially in 1930s and 40s, especially in the 1930s. So much so that the lady who wrote this book, From Time Immemorial, she wrote this beginning in the early 1960s when, as a very altruistic young girl, she volunteered with the United Nations to go to Lebanon with the United Nations to help supply funds and help for the Palestinian refugees. And when she got there, of course, she was all for the Palestinians. And in order to give them the help that the UN was going to give them, they had to go through the refugee camps, and they are horrible. They are a squalor. She went through the refugee camps in order to take a census and to register where each one of these families came from and how long they had lived in Palestine. It wasn't long before she and the other workers from the UN found that it was difficult to find somebody who really qualified to be a refugee, because most of them hadn't lived in Palestine more than 2 years before 1948, which doesn't qualify you as a long-term citizen of Palestine. But they finally settled on the definition that a Palestinian deserving help was a person who had lived in Palestine 2 years before 1948 when the Jewish state came into existence. Isn't that amazing? A lot of them came from Herzegovina in the Balkans. But usually it was a people that was just, the lower class from these Muslim nations. They'd just ship them over there and say, go over there. We need to have numbers there. Now, today, there's this claim that the reason there is such suffering in these refugee camps that are in Jordan, they're in Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt, and so forth, it's all the Israelis' fault. In 1948, when the Muslim nations declared war on the brand new state of Israel, as soon as they proclaimed statehood, 6 surrounding nations declared war and attacked. And it was to be a war of annihilation. The Israelis begged these Palestinians to stay and be part of Israel as full citizens. The vast majority left. The Muslim nations said, come away for 2 or 3 weeks. In 2 or 3 weeks, we'll annihilate these Jews and drive them into the Mediterranean. And then you can come back and not only have what you had, but what they had. So they all fled. And mind you, Israelis were trying to get them to stay. Some did, and they're full citizens. But alas, many didn't. And so you've got these terrible refugee camps. And they have no medical, they have no help from the host countries like Lebanon. They have no social help from their own people. In Lebanon, in all of those camps that are there, they can't even rebuild their house without permission from the Lebanese government. In Syria, some decades back, they needed some people to help them on the farms, and this lady who wrote the book from time immemorial asked, well, why don't you let some of the refugees in the camps come and help? They said, oh no, we need to keep them there. We don't want them to get comfortable and settled. Then we don't have a claim to go back and take Palestine. So they brought in Koreans to help. They've been mistreated, all right, but by their own brothers. But you see, there is such a propaganda machine that works and such a willingness to believe the worst about a Jew that they'll never believe what their own people have done to them. But all of this has mixed into the ingredients of what the prophets predicted is going to happen. According to Zechariah, in Zechariah chapters 12, 13, and 14 are one message. It's all about the battle for Jerusalem. According to Zechariah, it's the controversy between the surrounding nations, who are Muslim now, and this reborn state of Israel that's going to touch off the last war of the world that we call the War of Armageddon. I believe we're on the precipice of that right now. I know that there could be a war for which the world is not prepared happen in the Middle East before October. It's not the one predicted, by the way. This may be the one that scares the world into the point where they'll be willing to accept the Antichrist to come in and negotiate that false peace. But right now, the Middle East is the most heavily armed part of the world on this whole planet. They have the biggest arsenal in these, mostly in the Muslim nations. They have the biggest arsenal of weapons of mass destruction anywhere except in Russia itself. And they have been building and building and building for this battle. There's a disturbing prophecy in Isaiah chapter 17, verse 1, that does not seem to be tied in with the battle for Armageddon. Seems to be an isolated thing, but it's in the last days, where God says, I am going to utterly destroy Damascus so that it will never be inhabited again. That's not happening. It's about the last days. Israel has said, if the Syrians launch one weapon of mass destruction on Israel, they're going to obliterate Damascus. And there is enough chemical and biological warheads in Syria right now to wipe out the Middle East, not counting Iraq and Iran and Egypt. But if a major war begins over there in the near future, one of those weapons may be launched against Israel. And if they do, the Samson option is going to be exercised. You know what that means. It won't be the end. It'll open the door for the false prophet to come in and to make a peace in the Middle East, guaranteeing Israel's protection. But that will be the lie. It'll be a false peace. And again, the spark of Jerusalem will flash and cause the last war, which the Messiah will come back and stop. We're there. And I want to tell you something. It is not a normal time we live in. I get so alarmed with Christians who are running about building bigger and bigger buildings. You know, I've often thought about the Titanic. You know, when the Titanic hit the iceberg, I don't think that people running down to the ship store and buying a new suit or a new pair of shoes or they certainly weren't, the crew wasn't polishing brass. The ship was going down. This world is going down, and you're going up. Act like it. And I mean by that, and I'm a terrible fundraiser, and I'm not trying to raise funds, and I'm not trying to raise funds for any special group. I'm just saying this. If you're a Christian, make your efforts and your dollars count toward bringing people to the kingdom, to know Jesus as Messiah. We're in the last days. We can see it on every side. The signs are all before us. They're in the exact pattern and scenario that the prophets predicted they would be. We're near the end of the last days. And so it's time to set your priorities. It's time to go before the Lord and say, Lord, help me to live in a way that will not hinder the gospel. Help me to live in a way that will be able to help people to restore many rewards before they're caught up to meet Christ in the air. I find that the Christian world is under real attack right now, especially those who really believe this book. And that's why the Lord moved on me to do something uncharacteristic. I wrote a little book. In fact, this is the first time I saw it this afternoon. It just came in by air. It's called Why Do We Have Trials? And the Lord moved on me to write this book as certainly as he moved me to write The Late Great Planet Earth. I find 10 reasons in the scripture why God allows his people to go through trials. And only one of them is for discipline. There are a lot of people today who think because they've not been taught correctly, that if they have experiencing a trial, it must be because they must not have enough faith or because there's some sin in their life. Well, did Jesus have sin in his life? Yet Hebrews says he learned obedience through the things he suffered. Did Paul have sin in his life? Well, not so as you'd notice. And yet on several occasions he talked about being sick, and I know that's not a popular subject. Do you know that he only preached the gospel to the Galatians because God made him sick? It says it was because of an infirmity of the flesh that I preached the gospel at first to you. And he prayed 3 times specifically that God would remove the thorn in the flesh, which must have been some sort of a painful thing. And the Lord said, my grace is sufficient for you. And he said he learned through this that God gave him this to keep him from being overwhelmed by pride. So wasn't he confessing positively enough? Oh boy. Am I sick of some of the false teaching I hear? There's a place for positive confession, I agree, but boy, it's been carried overboard. There are a lot of saints under a guilt trip because of wrong teaching. And God is trying to develop their faith, trying to develop their maturity, trying to keep them back from areas of weakness, trying to help them to glorify him through trusting him in the midst of trials and so forth, and they're being made to feel guilty for it. You have to know the Word of God. I believe this is one of the most important books God's given me, why we have trials, and it's needed now. And I just want to say 2 more things. Video, the battle for Jerusalem. Where is America in prophecy? It ain't there. Why? Learn. God bless you. Thanks for listening.